In today's session, we're going to talk about a glaring gap in the ICAO manual on UPRT's guidance that came out in 2014, certainly not by design by the originators, but has been discovered in practical training when we're truly trying to prepare jet pilots to overcome the risk of loss of control in flight. Since 2016, APS has been integrating simulation, piston, and advanced jet training to really understand the features necessary for a pilot to be truly safe against this number one threat to air safety, loss of control in flight. Let's get to it. Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul BJ Ransbury, and I am a master instructor. I'm also the CEO of Aviation Performance Solutions, where we help pilots bring everyone home safely. And today we're going to be talking about the power of jet upset training, or specifically the power of jet UPRT for jet pilots. It's really exciting. This topic is really a follow-on to the great work that ICAO did back in 2014, and also the National Aviation Authorities, the FAA and EASA, have done a wonderful job of identifying what needs to be done. It's truly fantastic work, but what's missing, and really in many ways the most important part, is how to do it. Because we don't learn how to approach this threat, and we just keep on doing what we've been doing before, and just calling it UPRT, then we shouldn't be surprised by the threat persisting to be very threatening, as it's always being, and probably will be if we don't do something different in the way we train. So let's go ahead and jump right in here. So today we're going to be talking about how we enable a paradigm shift. What is that process? How do we leverage that ICAO model to help us in implementing this? And what is the gap that jet UPRT addresses? From there, we're going to talk about the 8 critical loss of control mitigation criteria and the key features of jet UPRT, specifically talking about this powerhouse, the S211 that APS uses. And we're very specific about which platforms we use because they need to be the very best at achieving the competencies that we want to try to accomplish. Then we're going to jump into high altitude jet UPRT. We're going to discuss the key concepts that are addressed in that area of the training. We'll take a look at the high altitude profile that APS implements with our jet. And then we're going to have a look at what the jet pilot UPRT mastery gold standard is. Then hopefully we're going to have time to get to some questions today. Ideally, we'd like to be about 30 minutes all in for the session, my portion on delivering the power of jet UPRT. And then we're going to have Captain Tom Wakus is going to be joining as our senior UPRT advisor in the questions session so that he can give you his perspective and also answer any questions that you might have. The other thing is, if you'd like to learn more about this overall series that we're doing, this is session 2 of 5. You can actually go right now to that QR code, which is on demand, and you can listen to an overview of the series, of which we just recently completed the recurrent UPRT, and I'll be giving you a link to that a little bit later in the presentation. And then also you can get ready to sign up for our next session coming up, which is going to be on applied loss of control and flight root causes, which will be next Friday. So please take advantage of those sessions. We look forward to seeing you in each one of these. These are all about you and helping you to be safer. All right, this quick review is just a reminder of how threatening the threat of loss of control in flight is and how we mitigate this risk. In our recent session, which I'll give you a QR code in a second, is talking about the various platform contributions and how we mitigate this risk, which is really necessary to create the paradigm shift that we need to drive down that risk. And a key part of that is not just on aircraft training, but also jet upset training is really instrumental in doing that, especially for jet pilots. Now, you can go ahead and do a deep dive on the application of the platforms and what proportion are they used and how much they contribute by simply going to that QR code in our last session, which was on recurrent UPRT. And I hope you enjoy that. And so if you want to learn more about this particular diagram, you can go back and have a look at that session. Okay, so this is the opening slide. And I think it's perspective building. If all jet and UPRT is to give pilots a competency in this situation, it really requires a very intentional training process to accomplish that. But I want to remind everybody that the very first priority competency is that we don't want to be in that situation in the first place. The second one, of course, is how to execute the recovery and to solve it. But really the most important value of recovery training is building the mental model to better understand the awareness, recognition, and prevention of the airplane upset in the first place. So really the key priority, in addition to the ones we've talked about, is the been there, seen that value, or more specifically for on-aircraft training, the tremendous value it brings is on human factors, which we're going to be talking about in session 4. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about how we actually use different training platforms to now make this situation something that pilots can understand, recognize, and prevent, or should they get there, be able to solve it. All right. So let's go ahead and jump right in here now and talk about what ICAO did in 2014 after 5 years' work with 40 organizations, 80 experts around the world, which APS had the honor to be part of. And they created some fantastic guidance and resources for the industry that it should follow. And as I mentioned earlier, it really talks about what to do. So with any critical training area, and especially important in upset prevention recovery training, we have to start with comprehensive academic training. That is the key, that is the foundation. But unfortunately, academic training on its own is quite limited in its ability to mitigate the risk of loss of control in flight for a number of reasons. The skills are counterintuitive. Usually they require a sequence and a movement of the controls that is different than what you would applied in your normal flight experience. And also what you end up finding is the human factors are just very, very incapacitating in an airplane upset event if you haven't had proper training and how to perform in spite of them. So let's move on to the next one now, which is on-aircraft upset prevention and recovery training. And most people see that, and also as ICAO envisioned, that would be accomplished in a piston aerobatic airplane. Now, ICAO doesn't require an aerobatic airplane. They strongly recommend it, and so do we. And in our judgment, you can't effectively deliver life-saving upset training unless you have an aerobatic-capable airplane and a highly competent instructor, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Now, the third component that they have is advanced simulation. There's a couple of flavors of that. We have non-type specific and type specific simulation. And you can see there's a number of ways to approach that. Now, it used to be just full motion simulators. Now fixed-based simulators add a lot, and now virtual reality as well. And APS uses all of these platforms in its program. So this is what ICAO talked about, and its ICAO manual on UPRT is the combination of these three components, of which you can see simulation has two flavors, the non-type specific and type specific, to mitigate the risk of loss of control in flight, and that was in 2014. Unfortunately, what we found delivering this, and we're the most active UPRT provider in the world with fully integrated upset prevention recovery training, there's a pretty massive gap between piston on aircraft training and then the experience people have in the simulator. Now, they're very much indispensable. They can't be missed, and they have to be integrated. What we really need to have is some way of mitigating and addressing this gap. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a lot of people think, well, let's just go up in a business jet and address that gap. Now, we're not opposed to doing some level of training in a business jet airplane, but it's very restricted in what it can do and what it can do safely, and very restricted in what it can contribute to the 8 critical mitigation criteria that we're going to talk about. So we consider the use of the business jet, while we don't oppose it, it's of questionable value and certainly is not the next step in our judgment after 3 decades and training thousands of pilots every single year. So let's now jump into the S211. Now, this is a swept wing glass cockpit, high altitude aerobatic, spinnable jet airplane. Now, even though we don't do spins in this airplane, it has the margin of safety that you have in any type of a stall or incipient spin maneuver. And so this is really a critical part that is missing that we found. So in 2016, we invested in our first S211 jet to mitigate this gap. But because for us, it's all about saving lives. It's not meeting the letter of the law of the regulation, even though that has to be done. That is just a pay to play. You have to address that as a bare minimum. And we go well beyond the bare minimum at APS, and we select platforms that provide the best training. If a business jet was the right platform, we would have one. We don't. We have a fleet of S211s, extra 300s, advanced simulation, virtual reality, and very robust academic training. So the on-aircraft jet training, jet aircraft, aerobatic capable, glass cockpit, swept wing is really the key. That's the critical jet pilot transfer of skill tools we need to mitigate that gap. And every jet pilot ideally needs this training to be fully prepared for the environment that they operate in. So this leads us later to a session on UPRT mastery about how the mitigation of the risk of loss of control in flight, the design of that program has to be really designed around what, where, and how you operate it. If you're a jet pilot, you really need to have real-world on-aircraft complex jet airplane at medium, low, and high altitude, and to be truly prepared. Now, it doesn't contradict, it complements the existing training, because you may get your type rating training and your recurrent training and address UPRT in the simulator. The training you receive at a UPRT provider should be directly in alignment with industry best practices and follow that best practice to be sure what you are teaching or receiving in that training is a direct complement to what you're trying to accomplish or you should be accomplishing in mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight. Now, one thing I will say is the very best training platform in the world for mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight is not the platform itself. It's the instructor that facilitates that training process, that brings their expertise to bear on you and your personality and your style and the platform being used to identify the transferable valuable areas to mitigate and minimize the negative transfer items, because every platform has items that don't transfer well. All right. For example, an aerobatic airplane, you can have control inputs in that airplane that work well in it, but don't transfer to a commercial airplane. Just like in the simulator, even though it's representative of how the real airplane works, its motion cueing is almost always wrong except for the initial onset of motion. So every training platform has great potential, but also great limitations. So the only way to truly mitigate this risk is a combination of platforms. Now, let's return to that circle that we saw earlier in the statistics. So we need to now take these platforms that are currently all red because loss of control in flight is the number one risk to air safety, and now drive down that risk by filling in the pie with the appropriate use of these training platforms. You can see the relative contributions as shown here, done by a provider that's following the Every Pilot in Control solution standard. Now, if you want to learn more about recurrent, we talked about that in great detail in session 1. There's the QR code to go and do that. So if you like what you hear, everybody, we'd love it if you would like and follow us. It helps us get our videos out to more people because, as I said, APS, our purpose is simple. We help pilots bring everyone home safely, and our brand promise is every pilot trained in control all the time. So we thank you for that in advance, whether you're live or watching the replay. Thank you for liking the content that we're producing. All right. The Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard was the initiative that APS launched in 2019 when we saw the ineffectiveness of just having fantastic industry guidance on what to do. What was missing was how to do it. So we freely released the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, which is available to anybody, any provider to optimize their training program that includes 5 key areas that inform the outer circle of initial training and the inner circle of recurrent training. And the first key element, as I mentioned before, is the instructor, an elite instructor, specially trained not just in upset prevention and recovery training, but modern upset prevention and recovery training, and knows how to work with pilots of all experience levels to identify and isolate and emphasize transferable concepts and mitigate or eliminate the negative transferable items. integrated program, as we've talked about, academic on-aircraft simulation, the right intensity of training, number of days, number of hours, the amount of study required to be effective. And as you can see in number 4, regulatory minimums are a minimum. And that is not at all should be the standard of what you need to accomplish in an effective UPRT program. Because as I said, the regulators did a fantastic job of identifying what to do. It's supreme guidance. It lacks very few elements. However, how to do it is where the devil in the details live. It's all about how. Because as I mentioned before, if you don't evolve the how to create a paradigm shift, you're simply doing what you did before under a different name. And then, of course, the right platforms that we're talking about here today. In fact, we're talking specifically about how the JET all-attitude platform now complements and reinforces an identified gap in the ICAO model that they issued. And then, of course, initial training has to be intense, and recurrent training, if done effectively, is complementing that initial training. So initial training, typically about 3 days. Recurrent training done well is about a day. Now, what we want to talk about now is going to be these 8 critical criteria. Now, we're not going to dive into these today, but what we do at APS is we have learned over 3 decades that these 8 critical criteria, they're not the only ones, but they're listed in the order here, are what a training platform needs to accomplish, and the instructor needs to leverage out of that platform to create the competencies for the pilot to be able to be ready for, be aware of, recognize, and prevent an airplane upset or recover from it. So if it doesn't inform or nail any of these areas, it's likely not an effective platform for mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight, in our judgment. So by having an effective program that is grinding on these 8 critical criteria, what we see is it's now generating these green circles of competencies get inserted into the typical ones we hear about all the time. Aeronautical decision-making, CRM, threat and error management. You can see now 2 green circles of upset prevention, upset awareness on the top, and then, of course, upset recovery at the bottom. That is the goal of an effective upset prevention and recovery training program. So the idea behind it is to take this bubble of competency that everybody carries around right now with the standard training that you receive at initial and recurrent that has established loss of control in flight is the number 1 threat to air safety, and now evolve it using every pilot in control solution standard with competent instructors and all the requirements of the standard to now expand that envelope, not just into the recovery region, but have a look how it expands into the awareness and the prevention region as well. So it's really exciting to see this evolution coming across the industry and what we're seeing for the outcomes of what an effective program can do. So what we're looking at here very, very briefly is we have every pilot and control solution standard. That's now driving the implementation or these particular mitigation criteria through an effective program. And each platform, you can see aircraft represented by an A, S represents simulator, V in this case represents virtual reality or type specific training. You can see that they each represent a different level of capabilities in each of those areas. You can see where the aircraft is green. You can see it in the top 4. You can see where a simulator is green. You can see it in the bottom 2, but you can see where neither one of them are green. It needs to be an integrated combination, for example, of repetition to proficiency or very low altitude all-weather upset. So that's the idea behind the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, and this is where the role of the JET comes into play. So let's now dive in. First off, understanding that when we're talking about these areas, we're now talking about the integrated combination of the on-aircraft platform with simulation. And on the right, we see here the JET, the S211 JET. And in the background, we see the paired integrated simulation program that should be occurring in close proximity within a day at the most to complement the on-aircraft jet upset training. So what are the targeted objectives? Well, first and foremost, the most important value of any on-aircraft training, and especially jet on-aircraft training, are the associated human factors. That is simply something you don't get in piston all-attitude training, and certainly something you don't get at all in advanced simulator training, is you need to experience what these airplane upset events look like, both in prevention, in awareness, and recovery in the real airplane, to have the fidelity of human factors so that you can truly say, been there, seen that. So should you face that in a complex jet airplane at high altitude, for example, You've been there. You know how to perform in spite of the incapacitating human factors that you'll surely be facing. And the jet airplane, the jet platform, especially the all-attitude platform, is really key at being able to accomplish that. Now, the next ones you can see for jet UPRT performance, there's a few critical areas. Transfer of skill to complex jet operations in the all-attitude environment. Different control and engine response time, inertia influences, speed impact on turn rate and radius. You simply don't see those in the on-aircraft training. Now, you will see that in the simulation, but that combination of fidelity of being in the real airplane, in a real jet, and seeing those turn rates and radiuses and inertial impacts is very compelling and very powerful. The other part of it is experiencing true swept wing stall characteristics in an airplane that has the margin of safety to do it. The reason why we don't go up in business jets and do full stalls or airlines and full stalls is because there's no margin of safety in doing it. Usually their margin of safety ends at the approach to stall. So the nice thing about the S211, it's a swept wing airplane, and its wing design presents swept wing stall characteristics. Now also, the glass cockpit is tremendously valuable. Now, some aerobatic piston airplanes will have that, but the combination of that jet performance and the glass cockpit environment is immensely valuable. Then the last point here today is the high altitude UPRT and the unique aerodynamics that you face in the real world. Even seeing that in simulation, it's just a completely different level of experience when you see that in the jet airplane. In the real world, it just makes a tremendous amount of sense when you do it that way. And in fact, when we get to the questions, we have a number of videos here that we can play if we have a break in the questions, and I'll show you some of those examples. All right, let's move on now to the high altitude critical concepts before we move on. So there's a few areas in here. You can see this very wonderful diagram where we can actually see the maneuvering margins and how they get reduced as you start going up in altitude. So the low speed versus high speed buffet, as you can see in the diagram, is really, really critical for pilots to understand that those maneuvering margins reduce as you go up in altitude. So not only are we seeing here with the indicated airspeed of the stall increasing towards MMO in this case, but also as the Mach number increasing, this increases, the stall angle of attack decreases. So there's added complexity in high altitude jet operations. The next one is going to be the dramatic thrust reduction. You can see this great diagram here. We can see the difference between a turbofan and a turbojet. While it's slight, is dramatic from sea level thrust of 100%. You can see now up at near maximum altitude, it can down to anywhere between 20 and 40%, depending on what that max altitude is and what the design of the airplane is. So really, really important to understand that. As part of that training, we also need to understand how we avoid the inadvertent slowdown into slow flight. That thrust limited condition is something you need to see in the real aircraft. And also that it requires more altitude loss to recover. And we have a great video that maybe I can play. We get into the questions where you can see that it just takes a very, very long time to recover from a stall, for example, at high altitude. There's a strong, strong tendency in the real world where the human factors are spiked for pilots to want to recover early like they would at medium and low altitude and just perpetuate that stall for many, many minutes, far longer than they need to. And they need to have patience to accelerate to their cruiser climb Mach before they try to level off, ideally at a level below where the stall occurred. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, how the stall angle of attack decreases with an increasing Mach number is something you can see very clearly when you go up in the real airplane. Now, another area that folks don't think about too much is the impact of reduced aerodynamic damping. The airplane is much more sensitive. You have to be very cautious, very smooth, very deliberate on the controls, because it's not very often that we hand fly the airplane above 25,000 feet. While an effective jet program, what we do in the S211 is we're up above 20,000, usually up above 30 as long as we get the clearance, hand flying the airplane, and you can see a dramatic difference in the performance between the airplane. Even at 15 to 18,000 feet and up above 30, it feels like a totally different airplane. And the beauty of the S211, its thrust weight is very much like a Learjet. So it's very representative of business jets in its performance, but it's safe, huge margin of safety associated with maneuvering it. And you can experience wake encounters, nose high, nose low, stall, and actually go through the process of recovering that airplane in a swept wing environment, in a glass cockpit, swept wing airplane, and it's just a wonderful experience. The other part of it really that people have a hard time with is something I want to repeat, and that's simply being patient. We always talk about as we go above flight level 250, while the human factors want you to accelerate and speed up, the aerodynamics really force you to slow down and be very, very intentional about how you handle the airplane. So the S211 is really a powerhouse when it comes to high altitude training and even low altitude training. And we see it being very, very capable and very representative of business jet performance and the airline performance, and is very transferable. But remember, the jet upset training platform like the S211 should be and has to be paired with the associated simulator training. Going into the simulator is the absolute very best way to get representative control, response, and feel, to be working in your environment, seeing your instrumentation doing what it needs to do. So the type-specific and non-type-specific simulator training as part of the ICAO model are critical, but we have found the real-world on-aircraft jet training is a massive gap in the ICAO model, which I said before, they did not intend to have. It just didn't seem likely realistic at the time that was going to happen, or maybe they weren't aware of how much the gap was going to be. With the amount of training that we do at APS, we see it all the time. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the high altitude profile, how we accomplish that in the S211. Now, remember, it's complementing simulator training, so this is not a standalone. The training starts in the on-aircraft. We start at low altitude in the S211, then we go to high altitude, and here's the typical profile. We take off, and we go to medium altitude phase 1, and we do calibration exercises. And from there, we climb it up into high altitude and repeat those calibration exercises, including the thrust limited slowdown condition, to see the massive, massive contrast in performance. And then we take a look at the right thing to do and sometimes the wrong thing to do. For example, when you get overbanked and attempt to do a split S type maneuver. Now, finish off the profile as we now take a very, very significant change in performance from high altitude at or near the maximum altitude of the airplane all the way down into the lower altitude, which is usually between about 10 to 15,000 feet, where we can see a massive change in the performance of the airplane, further highlighting the transferable value of the high altitude training. Then we continue with complex upsets, variable control field upsets to continue the training. So as you can see here, a full 90% of the high altitude profile is contrasting performance between medium altitude, high altitude, and lower altitudes all the time, reinforcing the original learning that we experienced in the jet airplane. So if you go back to the recurrent program, we talk a little bit about this. This is the UPRT Mastery Program. We're going to see way more of this in session 5, where we have a dedicated session on UPRT Mastery. But for jet pilots out there looking for the gold standard in upset prevention or recovery training as a jet pilot, it lives here. It's comprehensive academic training. It's on-aircraft piston training combined with jet training, low and high altitude, with non-type specific and type specific simulator training for you when it comes to APS. And we feel that we do set the gold standard to truly be mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight. So if you haven't signed up already, here's the QR code to go to session 5, where we talk about UPRT Mastery. I think you're going to really, really enjoy that. All right, folks, let's wrap this up so we can go to questions. So I just want you to remember that jet pilots need upset prevention and recovery training, but it has to be part of an integrated program. And in our judgment, to truly mitigate your risk or design your UPRT program around what, where, and how you operate, it necessarily requires jet upset training to complement academic training. Specialized academic training as well, high performance academic training is required, combined with piston, simulation, and also the program needs to be delivered in accordance with the international standard, the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, is pioneered by APS and freely released to the industry in 2019. So before we go to questions, I just want you to remember that APS and our team is here for you. Please ask your questions, give us a call, post them in this event, whether it's live or whether it's recorded. We would love to hear from you, so please do so. And we look forward to answering those questions online or on those phone calls. But right now, if you're on the live session, let's go to questions and deal with what we have now. And hopefully, if there's time, I'll have a chance to play a few videos. Let's go to those questions now. So Tom, I think that's a really good topic. So I want to get you involved here in the questions. But let me just introduce Tom, because you hear from our instructors a lot, and Tom has vast aviation experience too, and he's our director of UPRT Solutions. I can't think of a better gentleman to lead that program. But Tom started flying back when he was young in Michigan and Canada, Alaska. Then he's a graduate of Embry-Riddle, has a degree in aeronautical science with a focus on aviation safety and accident studies, flight instruction, flying freight, air ambulance operation, charter, airline as well, flight engineer, first officer, captain, flying the 737 Citations and Learjets, and has led safety programs, including FOCWA and ASAP programs. So Tom, we talked a lot about the importance of doing jet training, and I think we all understand that we're not saying that every pilot in the world should have this training, because I think it's probably unrealistic. I think the ICAO model is very, very effective, but those who can, there is a big gap in the ICAO model that we see that the on-aircraft jet training can accomplish. So corporate flight departments, military operators, some airlines, especially for their subject matter experts, get a huge value out of that. Do you want to have any comments on that, or say a few things just overall on what you heard today or want to share?
Yeah, it's great to be here. And I'll just say that, oftentimes with my conversations with flight departments and military units and airlines, they feel like it's a complex problem, but helping them understand how we can mitigate that risk fully in 2.5 to 3 days, and helping them understand that journey, that it's not just one platform, but addressing the human factors, bringing in the jet to address the jet specific concerns, and then going into the sim. And the jet is just an integral part of that program.
Absolutely. Let me just pull this diagram up here. And it's something, for example, that you see all the time. So we're seeing a massive transition in our customers, who I think we've been successful at getting them to embrace the integrated program that ICAO put out in 2014. And there's a lot of resistance, because many people feel that either they just need simulation training, or the gap they're missing is just on aircraft training. But in reality, it's a combination of everything. So the ICAO model is right on target. But we do see that jet program makes a lot of difference. So what is the rationale what is your sense as to why people are starting to embrace the jet? I mean, other than the fact we're talking about it more, maybe what are the conversations you're having? And then after folks go through that training, maybe what they're sharing with you, because you deal more directly with them than I do.
Absolutely. And I think jet pilots are really starting to understand the important piece that jet plays, in the sense that while we address the human factors on the piston airplane, going into the jet and validating that the strategy works on a swept wing platform, being on an advanced flight deck, for instance, doing the instrument recovery training. More than 70% of these mishaps occur in IMC, or reduced visibility, nighttime. So we want to make sure that they address all of these concerns, and particularly the wear. So, with the high altitude piece you mentioned earlier, we've seen an increase in the number of these mishaps that have initiated at altitude. So we want to make sure that they understand the rarefied air up there, having those manual handling skills, and being able to address, threat on every piece of where they operate is just hugely important.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring in a question here from Skip Johnson, who we well know from United Airlines. Skip is a regular attendee, but I think he has a great point here to bring in. And Skip's comment is even with the experienced UPRT pilots at my airline, I brought their norm on, Skip. Let's go to your question. Let's go to this one. He says, I think the lessons learned from Air France 447 is a gold mine in what you demonstrate with your high altitude training, the effects of high Mach MMO, lower AOA stall, and the delayed recovery in high altitude environment. Had that crew had this training, they would have recognized the risk, the entry, and they accurately diagnosed the stall, and finally had the patience to allow the aircraft to recover. They certainly had the altitude, but not the training or capability. Very tragic. Well, I think we would all agree with that, and we Don't want to certainly dive into any specific accident or talking about crew members, but absolutely agree that in this particular case, when you take a look at the background and the recency of experience of that crew when it comes to stalls, was fairly remote, if not very remote. And to your point, Skip, especially in the Airbus that you fly, Skip is also a United Airlines A319, 320 pilot, is the amount of time it takes for that horizontal trimmable stab to actually reorient itself by going forward on the control stick. I flew the Airbus for a number of years. Takes time, takes patience for that nose to come down to reduce angle of attack, to get it back into controlled flight. So we always want to look back on these accidents and what we can learn. And I do think that high altitude training would have helped that crew. But more than anything else is just getting back to the fundamentals of flying. So yes, a lot to learn there. Tom, anything to add on this by Skip?
Yeah, it's just, I think with automation and RVSM and all the other things that go on these days, most folks are just not hand flying airplanes at altitude like they used to, and they don't have those manual handling skills. And, being in an upset for the first time at altitude and flying the airplane for the first time at altitude together is just not a great match.
Yeah, it's very easy to over control the airplane at altitude. It's the first time. I know that Skip's also a fighter pilot. I know when we first built this program, having to hand fly almost all the time at high altitude in fighters. And when we first built the program, I was thinking, gosh, there's not a lot to this. But as we started taking people through the program, it didn't occur to me or realize that we don't see the world the way it is. We kind of see it the way we are, and that the experience that we have in the military of hand flying airplanes at high altitude and just naturally understanding this, reduced aerodynamic dampening, the fundamentals of aerodynamics and how they change, shouldn't be taken for granted. It's an area of experience that pilots who haven't had that background really need to benefit from. So we see this high altitude profile is very, very rich in learning and really an eye-opener in many ways. The amount of time it takes to recover, how sensitive the airplane is, the massive change in performance just by going up 20,000 feet in the airplane from the teens up into the mid-30s is just dramatic. So, Tom, anything else to share on that before I bring Nick's comment in?
Just simply the fact that the amount of time jet pilots spend at altitude not having addressed that critical piece of the wear part it needs to be mitigated.
Absolutely. So, Nick, great question here. Are you aiming these courses at individuals or airlines' corporate training departments? Do you see this training becoming mandatory for all pilots? No, we don't see it become mandatory for all pilots. I think what we would love to see is just the effective ICAO model embraced. And I've mentioned this a few times now, is that we all should be very grateful for the heavy lifting the regulatory agencies did, starting with ICAO as an oversight organization, national aviation authorities like the FAA, EASA, other authorities around the world. But it's what to do, but not how to do it. And unfortunately, a true paradigm shift in overcoming the risk of loss of control in flight is approaching this in a very, very different way. Giving people the skills that they need to be able to truly recognize and prevent or, if necessary, recover from these particular situations requires very unique experience, unique training. It's very difficult to ask the industry to teach something that it's never taught before without having very intense training. The problem that we find, we have a location in Europe, and we saw as soon as on-aircraft training became regulated, there was so much downward pressure on time and cost and experience of the instructors. It essentially just ended up being more of what they were doing before under a different name called UPRT. So it's unlikely we're going to see a huge change in risk. Now, when people do it effectively, organizations do it effectively, like we see, for example, in Delta Airlines released their program they did with APS in 2023, they demonstrated a full 50% reduction in precursor upset events as a result of their program. Now, it wasn't just the paired UPRT program with APS, it was their tremendous leadership they had, their data-driven insights and changes in how they operate their airplanes as a result of that investigation. So done well, this can make a huge difference. But to answer your question directly, Nick, we are just identifying the gap. We are identifying if an organization, a corporate flight department is very common, or individual pilots have the ability to and the time or the convenience to seek out jet training, on-aircraft jet training done effectively, it's a very big step towards mitigating their risk as a jet pilot. As for airlines, it's quite unrealistic from a time and cost standpoint for an entire airline to do this. Having said that, now the airline subject matter experts that are getting trained in how to now take a paradigm shift UPRT program back to the airline, those core cadre of UPRT experts, where they partner with an organization like APS, would get huge benefit from experiencing the human factors of the jet performance in a real airplane that very often they've never had a chance to experience even themselves. So that's a long answer to a short question. Tom, anything to add to that?
No, just that to your point, I mean, we do train owner operators and corporate flight departments and military units. And to Nick's question, it's that what, where, and how you operate. So military ISR pilots versus, corporate pilots, they all have a little bit different solution that we customize to. And I think, from a mandatory standpoint, while it's not regulated, I think every professional pilot should strive to get this training.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's a great point. So what we see, I'm kind of doubling down on Nick's question here a little bit, is that there is a lot of value that comes from a pilot, no matter where they are, whether they're an owner operator, they're at the flight school, or they're with a airline, of going through a program that follows the ICAO model. So let me just give you an example. So we train the United Aviate Academy students. They're here in Goodyear in Arizona. Skip's part of that program. Is they come and go through a program that we've specifically designed for flight school operators, which is the gold standard in UPRT for flight schools worldwide. United Airlines is just very much a safety always organization. It's a core value to them. But that program we designed for students, which comprises instructor-led live training, online preparatory training, on-aircraft piston training, and simulation in a piston simulator, is very different than what we would, for example, provide to a Citation 10 pilot. So that particular pilot operates at a crew and high-altitude multi-engine jet, high performance, and that program would be different. It would have to include not only the academics, but specialized academics in high-altitude, high-performance operations, include piston training for the human factor side of it, but necessarily include on-aircraft jet training. And we would see a requirement for also a couple flights, of which one should be at high altitude than jet, because there's just so much more to learn than the simulator needs to be in their class of airplane, or ideally type-specific training in a level D full motion simulator. We augment our program with virtual reality as well. So the idea behind that is to whether you're flying a piston airplane, a King Air, or a Citation, or a 737, when you come through the program at APS, is we design the program, as Tom mentioned, around what, where, and how you operate. But before you leave, you have the opportunity to go right back into your own airplane in virtual reality and experience all the incredibly powerful life-saving tools. So when you leave, you experience that in your airplane. So when you leave, we truly feel that's a genuine been there, seen that experience, which is what it's all about, being able to transfer it back into your environment should you need those skills. Ideally, awareness, recognition, and prevention, but if necessary, recovery. Tom, anything else?
I would just add that I think, we mentioned the jet and the manual handling skills at altitude, but I think that's the jet specifically is good for all those peripheral outcomes of vastly improved pilot competencies that we talk about, the manual handling skills, the threat and error management, and applying those concepts on a jet is just imperative.
Yeah. So, I see our role at APS as number one, helping, providing information to the industry, identifying what we feel to be gaps, and where we can, like we did with the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, is offering the ability and the guidance for providers to be able to maximize their ability with whatever assets they have to deliver an effective program to mitigate the risk of loss of control in flight. We also identify gaps. We've identified the gap in the jet training side of it and providing a mitigation and a solution to that. In no way are we saying that the industry has to do it. In fact, it's likely they never will do it. It's simply the very best way to mitigate your risk if you're genuinely serious about being the safest pilot you can possibly be. So with that, Tom, I'm not seeing any more questions. Any final words or comments you want to share with everybody before we wrap up today?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for being out there. It's just been a great opportunity to share this information on the JET program. If you're ever in Arizona, you don't have to fly with us. Just come and have a tour. We'd love to show you around. Our passion is saving lives. You get here and we'll take good care of you. So we look forward to seeing everybody in Arizona. Tom, thank you so much for all the hard work you do each and every day, bringing these programs to those folks out there trying to do the very best they can for their passengers, their families, for themselves to be safe.
Thank you, BJ.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.